Very good.
Thank you very, very much, Mark, for that overly generous introduction. This is a little sketch I did a while ago. It refers in part to some of the visions that we were presented with in Sean Kelly's talk, actually, where you shared God and God shared you, and the world comes into being through a process of mutual recognition. And the tongue is extended Kali-like, but it's also supposed to evoke those familiar images of the infant imitating the caregiver, neonatal infant imitating the caregiver. I'm not going to dwell on that anymore. This is going to be, in contrast to many of the talks here, it's going to be a fiercely empirical talk with data and everything. But I do my science within the humanities. Science is one of the humanities as far as I'm concerned, and I will fight to the death to mend that division. The theme is language first and foremost, which may seem inappropriate for a conference on gays, but I'm going to work very hard to bring the two together. I have a linguistic background, but I feel that the study of language has lost track of what it's about, what the word language refers to. When we speak of language, we do so confidently because it's such an integral part of our lives, and we speak of English and French, we use texts all the time. And as far as I can see, there are two very broad ways one might come at language. And the first one views language as a form of message passing. This is a familiar way to view things. A form of message passing, encoded messages that are transferred from one place to another. This is the conventional way of construing language that underlies, as far as I can see, all of the language sciences. Another perfectly reasonable way to come at language is to ask what the hell happened to our species. Something happened in the last 5 million years, and it's not very good for the planet, but it certainly changed things. And that doesn't necessarily refer to a single system, doesn't necessarily refer to message passing, does refer, in contrast to the first definition, to something we do with our voices, and I'm going to say with our whole bodies. And so there's this rather ugly term, which I first met in Mataran and Varela's Tree of Knowledge book, languaging. A bit like learning to stop worrying and love the bomb. I used to resist this term, but now I see a use for it in order to get away from the idea of language as some kind of monolithic system. Now, when we view language as a form of message passing, which is the sort of pre-theoretical framing, and not a lot of thought has gone into this, but it undergirds all of mainstream linguistics in the 20th century. It allows us to identify objects which are obviously carefully, politically, socially constructed, like English and French. You can't have something like English and French without armies, nations, states, educational curriculums, and all those kinds of things. In everyday talk, these are discrete objects, French and English. They're systems of codified message exchanges. And it doesn't really matter much whether you talk about something we do with the voice or something we do with writing, or flags, or smoke signals, or semaphore, or emojis. It takes a little bit of effort to see the enormity of this abstraction and how far it is removed from the vocal practices that we have been doing for 5 or 6 million years ago. So at the start of the 20th century, we had the birth of structuralism lies, of course, with the Saussure and language sciences. I just illustrate something of the tenor of the time up here by putting the periodic table of the elements up there with the International Phonetic Alphabet. This is, of course, a more modern version of it, but there was this, at the start of structuralism, there was this need to integrate and make sense of an awful lot of observations and to provide some kind of meaningful framework within which new observations could be put. Now, in the case of the elements, that worked out spectacularly well. The International Phonetic Alphabet was meant to capture, in this case, all consonantal contrast that might be found in the world's languages, but the work was done by European linguists, and the system turned out, unlike the periodic table of the elements, to be heavily biased in favor of Indo-European languages, and English and French in particular. The second half of the 20th century saw a radical turn as the computational metaphor came into being, the computational theories of mind, the works of Chomsky and Fodor, and the emphasis was here on structures, syntactic structures were seen as central to language, meaningless syntactic structures. The whole business of language then, from a technical point of view, became caught up in a particular view of mind, which is heavily contested at this stage anyway. But both these approaches, the structuralist and the Chomskyan, valorize an abstract, mode-independent, literate intellectual capacity. Both Chomsky and Saussure display a frightening disregard for their primary data in moving from what people actually do to the abstract systems of thought. So in Saussure's case, we have long but not parole, although I believe we've got new work, which Saussure's work is still unfinished. They found something quite recently in Paris, and we believe he's going to reconnect to parole. So it's nice to see someone like Saussure actually coming back into focus. Chomsky, of course, made the distinction between competence and performance, and Chomsky is notorious for ignoring what people actually do and just making it up from the armchair. And both systems are dealing with the passing around of encoded messages, and I'm going to suggest that neither of these is much use in understanding what happened to our species in the last 5 million years. They both sort of conceive, here's my phenomenology, they both conceive of us as being like these, hermetically sealed from each other, and the message is composed inside one such bubble and then passed to the other where it's decomposed. And of course, I think I'm pushing an open door here when I suggest that we're actually far more up in each other's business, as it were, as we talk all the time. Matthew Broom, channeling Ordine Lane, said we don't see minds inside bodies, but we see persons, and I think this is a very useful point of contact here. So if linguistics conventionally construed treats language as encoded message passing only, languaging has yet really to be defined. Maybe it will resist definition, I'll be quite happy with that, but it's going to be a new territory in which we work. You're all aware, of course, of very many currents in contemporary cognitive science, often labeled 4E, which themes of embodiment and action, distributed cognition, and I would say also dialogism, are becoming very, very important. And these very important concerted efforts to reconceptualize the person are struggling when it comes to language, because the whole framing of the debate is so caught up in this linguistic, is caught up in a particular view of mind. Languaging, as I conceive it, involves the entire body. It involves just gestures and the orientation of the head, the morphology of the body. It involves gaze, as we'll see. You can look at some evidence of that. It necessarily involves the voice. This is not something we do with writing. This is something we do with the voice. And languaging always happens in context. Languaging is not removed from context. Perhaps the greatest sin of linguistics has been in assuming that there was something sensible we could say about language independently of its context. So in languaging, we will not be discussing the pen of my aunt is in the garden, unless we know which pen, which garden, which ant, who said it, why, when, where, and who heard it. There's a very important hypothesis that came out of Michael Tomasello's lab, which many of you may know. You all know that Chomsky's story of language presented, shall we say, a puzzle to neuroscientists, because our brains are not radically different from ape brains. They're hardly different at all, except for a bit of swelling in the frontal lobes. And so it was unclear where this language acquisition device was and how it could be so camouflaged among all those neurons that look like they're there for other purposes. Tomasello spotted one biological change that did happen in the last 5 or 6 million years ago, which was the development of the white sclera of the eye. This is the cooperative eye hypothesis, which is a very small biological change with potentially huge, enormous consequences for the manner in which we coordinate with respect to each other, in the way in which we become all entangled in each other's business, as it were. So I believe this is, if you're going to look at biological evolution, this is the place to look. And it's worth noting that apes have dark sclera. And chimpanzees do attend to where other chimpanzees are looking, but they refer to head direction only, whereas the eye, and you've all had someone give you the side eye at some stage, we are incredibly sensitive to where the eyeball is looking and not just the head. It's worth noting that in the Planet of the Apes, the ape is portrayed like this with a white sclera. It makes him look really brainy, doesn't it? So Tomasello's cooperative eye hypothesis suggests that something happened which led to us all being wrapped up in situations of joint attention from the earliest age. So infants from a very, very early age learn to Machiavellian style manipulate the gaze of their caregivers, and so that in very many situations we are attending to the same things, we are coming at the world from the same point of view, we are attending to the same threats, things have common salience, and in this way we come to occupy a shared world, it seems to me. And it's the one thing language seems to do, and I know we need more solid terms here, it is to construct a shared world. Now, speaking in the co-presence of others leads to a dynamic entanglement of speakers and listeners. It leads to situations of shared understanding. There's an awful lot of work in linguistic alignment, many of you will be familiar with. It is one of the means by which we establish this common ground. And common ground is a theme that's acquired monumental importance, I think, in all of our work, no matter which perspective you're coming from. You can see it as the basis of socially shared cognition, if you like. We find evidence in speaking of whole body entrainment, if we're standing looking at each other. I spent a little bit of time once looking at gaze coupling, and indeed blinking. Blinks are modulated as we speak to each other. So I analysed a lot of data where we had dyadic conversations, people sitting down in a lab, just please have a conversation. Oh, all right. And they talk to each other, and you've got cameras on each, and you see where people are looking, and it's kind of nice. Here's some data. I promised you some data, didn't I? What's shown here is, so each point on the x-axis here is data from one subject in one pair, and for each subject you see two data points. One is the proportion of the gaze aimed at the other when speaking. The other is the proportion of the gaze aimed at the other when the partner speaks. And what you see is, for everybody, we look more when we're listening than when we're speaking. And there's this well-coordinated dance that arises. Dan, in responding to Sean's talk, spoke of communicative engagement. This is something we can study very, very empirically indeed. There's a whole little dance in dyadic conversation. Once, for example, I get the floor, I'm quite free to look away and wax on eloquently, and you are more or less compelled to pay attention to me if you ever want to get the floor back. And as terms are negotiated, the eyes have to lock and meet, and there's this wonderful dance that goes on. So that was kind of fun, and I'm not going to show you any blinking, but blinks are very much part of this. They get sucked in, we blink far more than is necessary to moisten the eyeballs, and the blinks become part of this constitutive whole body entanglement that happens as we converse. But dyadic conversation does not exhaust languaging. Far too much attention, because of our focus on message passing, we seem to have decided that dyadic conversation is the good child of the family. This is where to look when you want to understand language. Now, I have chosen for my empirical object of study something different, and I will insist that it is language. It is what I call joint speech, and joint speech has a very simple empirical definition. Isn't this nice? The act of uttering the same words at the same time with multiple people. So examples of this are in practices of prayer. We find it integrated into all cultures and ritual. It's a very important part of the structures of ritual. We find so this simple empirical definition picks out specific domains of human activity. It picks out the domain of protest as well. Lock her up. What do we want? Free education. The people united will never be defeated. People always chant when they have collective concerns that they need to bring to someone's attention. It's oddly enough, I find myself now in the company of football fans going, sorry, and other nasty things. And each of these forms of chanting has their own characteristics. They differ, but they all meet this empirical definition. They all speak of subjective concerns, collective concerns, though. And when you put them together, something quite remarkable happens. So there are some obvious, again, I'm not a philosopher, so I like what's on the surface. There are surface features that are very, very important, that characterize situations of joint speaking. For starters, now how's your definition of language going to work if we can no longer distinguish speakers and listeners? Because in joint speaking, there is no speakers and listeners. We're all both at the same time. Furthermore, it's not quite clear who we're addressing. If you're saying the rosary and God is listening to it, I assure you there's no news value in it. He's heard it all before. Protests are usually held in the absence of the person who's addressed. The texts that are uttered, the Chomsky program emphasized generativity and creativity, and that was one of the main linchpins of his response to Skinner and the behaviorist approach to language. And yet here, there's no creativity. Texts are already known, and they were authored elsewhere by other people. And here's something really weird. There's an awful lot of repetition. This is common to prayer, protest, and the football terraces, and several other privileged occasions. We repeat things an awful lot, this tells us that it's not what's said that's terrifically important, it's that it be said. So this draws our attention to the ethical concerns that arise in uttering. For every time something is uttered, there are responsibilities. When we discuss an abstract sentence like the pen of my aunt is in the garden, someone said that. Whose ant is it, and why did they say it, and what were they trying to achieve? Here it really matters that it actually be spoken. I find the emerging vocabulary of inaction broadly considered to be extremely useful here, because that seems to describe what's going on here. And identities are being enacted. If we are Manchester United fans, then we shout that out loud. We're Manchester United fans! And we do it again and again, every weekend. And that assures us that we are Manchester United fans. When we recite a creed, we are very much creating our identities as specific kinds of religious constituents. There's a structural feature you find across these which jumps out at you once you get away from the speaker-listener message passing framework, which is that there's a call and response are very, very common, and frequently the roles of call and response are asymmetrical in that the caller may be a single person, not always, but maybe a single person, and the response be quite general. Now, if a mob is coming after you with pitchforks, don't try and argue with them, run. It's not good to try and reason with the mob, but crowds have a bad reputation when it comes to rationality. And when we look at the structures which are allowed by joint speech, we see a way of dealing with this. What we see is that a lot of the propositional complexity of the collective message can be outsourced, as it were, to the one leader. And here we have the role of the priest, we have the role of the political figure who articulates the demands, and we also have a means for everyone buying into this through this joint speech mechanism in shouting amen right on, the expression of generalized assent, which ensures that we're all part of what's being spoken. And the idea that one might say something more complex than lock her up under these circumstances is evidence in the care and attention that are given to liturgical structures, which are nothing other than the very, very careful curation of these call and response things, making sure that no idea gets lost, and those are centuries and millennia. In fact, if you go back to the oldest piece of literature known, the Temple Hymn of Kesh from Samaria, 2600 BC, there was a text which survived for 1,000 years, unbroken. The Akkadians had to translate it then. And it has this call and response structure. It's clearly verse, chorus, and at the end of when you get to the chorus, it's all, I don't know the words off by heart, it's in cuneiform as well, it's not my specialty. But it clearly shows that this has been around for a long time. I also have never encountered a culture that does not use joint speech in some form. I mentioned generalized assent, and there's something else that happens which is really interesting that you wouldn't have thought of if you're studying sentences written on the page, which is the distinction between speech and music goes away. Or rather, we can identify a continuum where once people start repeating things, sometimes, well, let's start with a non-repeated version. So one thing that joint speech is used for is the swearing of oaths of allegiance. When you become a citizen of a new country, you're required in public to stand up and say, I, of, and then you utter your commitments. And because it's a purely instrumental thing and it's done once, it's one of these performatives in the Austen sense, there's no need for you to know the text off by heart. People are reading it, and there's no musicality to the voice. It's very much like a standard voice. But once you start repeating things, of course, musicality enters. We're dealing with the whole body, so people start using their body, and stress syllables start to be enunciated clearly, and furthermore, punching gestures are made, and so rhythm enters. And when you repeat a specific intonational contour, it becomes musical. And as we move further over and we enter the world of chant, chant is a beautiful English word because it doesn't differentiate between speech and music. And when we look at forms of music that are chanted, we find minimum instrumentation, we find no meter. What we find is that the phrases are dictating, the spoken phrases are dictating the musical phrases, and we find no polyphony. So we've got monophone and monotone intonation. It's worth noting as well that the Wahhabis, who are so hard on music and don't like music at all, but all the ISIS propaganda came with chants overlaid. You know? No instruments, no polyphony, but chants are perfectly fine. And indeed, in Islamic culture, what we call music is a couple of different things, some of which may or may not be haram, and some of which are very important. I've spent too much time on this slide, but it's great. Joseph Shear this morning mentioned many examples in which such collective enacted experience don't reduce to individual ones, and I think that's a very important point. So joint speech is at the center of highly valued practices and rituals in every human culture. It's accorded the highest significance by practices. We care about these: liturgy, oaths, protests, we care. Football, we care. It's a means of enacting collective identity, collective subjectivity, and it's entirely invisible under received approaches to that. I had to invent the bloody term. There was no term of art. There's 10 times more literature on speaking in tongues than there is on joint speech. How many people here have spoken in tongues? That's what about. So, okay, we're going to move it along. Now, if joint speech is invisible under message passing accounts, when we turn to joint speech, we're encouraged to pay attention to what's happening with the eyes and with gesture. Joint speech activities all point to the creation, maintenance, and sustaining of a common ground. And gaze is important in joint speech, and it functions very differently, as you would expect, than in conversational speech. There are two main patterns found in joint speech. Either there's a common focus, such as the leader or the priest or Freddie Mercury on stage at Live Aid, in which joint speech is accompanied by joint gaze. So everyone looks at the same direction. There's no negotiation. That's not a dynamic thing. Everyone's just looking at it could be a birthday cake. Everyone's looking at the same direction. Or there's no common focus at all, as in choral music, for example, where everyone's just facing out, nobody's looking at anybody, and the eyes are perfectly free. That's remarkable. Here we have a form of language in which the eyes have been freed up from the voice for once. This is very unusual otherwise. Now, I can wax on about joint speech all night. Joint speech at ucd.ie is a website devoted to this with lots and lots of examples. There's a free book. This morning I got the word that the book has a publisher now, so I'll probably have to take down the electronic copy shortly. So go there and get yourself a free book. It's anyway, moving on. If we view languaging then as a catch-all term for these practices that establish common ground and that facilitate coordination, what we see is in conversation, the gaze and the voice are completely entwined. The gaze is very much part of the mechanism by which conversations are sustained. In joint speech, the voices are very tightly aligned, but the eyes are far less constrained. And if they are, it's only this towards a common focus. So that sort of raises, there's another logical possibility, is there? Yes, there is. What happens can we find a case where the voice is silent, but the eyes are synchronized? I'm the kind of weird guy who goes into the cinema and sits with his back to the screen and looks at everybody and goes, what's happening with the eyes? Hitchcock used to say he likes to play his audience like the orchestra leader. He likes to make them look various directions. So here's a little bit more data. I have 10 subjects watch a 3-minute clip from The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And I track their eye movements. So this is not synchronized in clock time, it's synchronized in film time because they came in one after another. This here shows horizontal movement of the eyes only over those 3 minutes. The top trace is 10 subjects overlaid on each other. The bottom blue and red traces are 2 independent measures of synchronization. And what you can see is there are some portions where the eyes are completely all doing the same thing. Now, Sergio Leone, who made The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, is a very strident director. He tells you where to look. You're usually in no doubt where to look. There are times where there's some variation, but in general, the eyes are very, very highly synchronized. This is a tiny example. I don't mean this to suggest that we're going to unlock the mysteries of film by looking at eyeballs, but I do think that it should encourage us to ask if the common world arises from such activities. We need to consider synchronized voicing without the negotiation of gaze, as in joint speech, the situation of dialogue in which the voice and the eyes come together, and bring these into conversation with the common ground through synchronized gaze without the voice. Now, this would encourage us to ask what we mean by synchronization. What is the temporal framework? What are the temporal structures that we mean? But we live now in post-screen humanity. I'm already trying to get over the advent of writing. Writing really messes with my thesis. Writing changed everything. Joint speech does not belong on the page, and every piece of speech and language technology that's ever been developed has been developed with the message passing thing in mind. I've considered developing technology for joint speech, and I'm not sure if it's a good idea. With the populist wave reaching around the world now, I originally thought of it as a voice for the disenfranchised, and given the horrible way the internet's going, I'm scared. I don't know. I'd love some suggestions whether you think this is a good idea or not. It's worth reminding ourselves that we've been using the voice for all of those 5 or 6 million years. Writing is only 5,000 years old, for God's sake. And the screens are even more recent. Right? Even images have only been around for a little while. We forget that most people at most time lived in lives without images. And now here we are, and we're saturated with images, and we're all on our phones, and we're on our laptops, and our eyes are involved, but the voice is silent. And this is quite a remarkable change of affairs, that the voice should be silenced while the eyes are doing something similar. We know that we are being coordinated by our technologies. Richard Lewis's talk emphasized how the tools shape us. Well, I think there's work for empirical scientists to do here in paying attention to the manifest ways in which our bodies are being coordinated. We all know that these are affecting our bodies. We get slumps, they genuinely shape our bodies now. With the advent of screens, we may be entering a new wave of coordination, and with that, a new way of establishing common ground. Now, I'm not suggesting a common ground for the whole of humanity. I'm starting right here. We're here in this room together. That's a sort of a common grounding. We'd have to work harder to establish commonality with more remote people. So the voice and the gaze work together in ways that we've missed by and large. Joint speech is a great way of learning to reconceptualize language and paying attention to the practices, the contexts, and the purposes to which we use our voice and coordinate. And I'm going to stop there. So.
I wonder if in your group speech you consider the so-called human microphone.
Occupy
Wall Street. So
the human microphone. The human microphone is a wonderful example. So at the Occupy Wall Street protest in New York, the New York police outlawed the use of amplification, and the protesters got around this in a way. It wasn't actually originated there, but it had gone on. It found elaboration there. They did something very, very clever, and there's something you can learn from the human microphone. So the way the human microphone works is I stand here and I say, "What do we want?" And big circular all around me goes, "What do we want?" And for a large crowd, a circle outside them goes, "What do we want?" And in this way, we can pass the message out, broadcast it. We have to learn to chop our speech up into small little portions. Zizek is terrible at this. He was the one person who couldn't do it. But there's something very important about this, which is when you speak, you are responsible for what you speak. Linguistics is missing the ethical component. You are responsible for your words. And if you volunteer to be a cog in a machine, like in the human microphone, you may find yourself speaking words that you don't like. So they very cleverly added a parallel channel where you can signal with your hands what your affective response is to the words that you're saying. So you can say, "Hey, I'm happy saying, what do we want? No, lock her up, not really, lock her." So that separation is really, really clear. And yeah, go on.
So a brief follow-up then. In really large crowds, like in American football matches, and I'm sure it's the same thing, I feel my guts vibrate at the frequency of the crowd chanting. It's a physical thing. I don't think it was quite strong enough to have that at least consciously at Occupy Wall Street, but I wonder if there wasn't a subliminal, literally a corporeal resonance.
Quite possibly. The biophysical effects of speaking collectively are quite strong. We've done an fMRI study, incidentally, where we found that cortical activation is different when you're in communion with a live person compared to when you're in communion with a recording, because the recording doesn't have that sort of plasticity. That was hard to do in the scanner. Most people in church choirs are not there because they're not there for religious reasons. They're there because of the buzz, because the feel of this glorious feeling of speaking as one is well known to everyone who sings in the choir. Yeah, great observation. So, James?
Oh, hey, great. That was really nice, and I liked how you just were kind of sensitive to emphasizing the complexity of the phenomenon you've got here. Right, so in that spirit, I just wanted to ask you about your definition of joint speech. Could you maybe go back to the slide?
Yeah. I think the definition is very, very important. It's speech spoken. There you go. Uttering. I said uttering to include. I didn't want a speech-song distinction. Uttering the same words at the same time by multiple people. Yeah.
Okay, so I was thinking there are a number of different phenomena there, which I just wanted to ask you about. So, you've got the kind of case where a number of people happen to say the same thing at the same time, but they're not doing it together.
Accidentally?
Yeah, well, say like in a class, so a school class where the teacher asks a question and all the kids shout out. There's a sense in which, right, there's that kind of case. And then there's maybe a case.
I've lost to say about that case one.
Yeah. And then there's a different kind of case where maybe like they're having some sort of contest, like shouting over one another, where it's kind of oppositional.
Yeah.
And then there's maybe a third kind
That
of
doesn't fit it because they're not saying the same thing at the same time. Yeah.
Oh, well, maybe they are. Maybe it's like they've got the loudest one to say.
Maybe everyone's saying, pick me, pick me, pick me, pick me, yeah.
And then a final type case where like they're speaking together in like a very strong sense, like chanting, right?
Yeah.
Where there seems to be a kind of coordination together. It's kind of like this running, racing, and going for a run together. What I'm trying to get. I was wondering what you have to say about that.
Yeah, I
think joint speech, what you really nicely point out, is the strongest kind.
Yes, and I don't want to be essentialist about this. This is just a means of directing our attention. I use an empirical definition like someone else uses a microscope. It's like, pay attention to this. So it brings rituals and such practices to the fore. Primary school classrooms are a really interesting case, and not just primary schools within the rich Western democracies. And if you go to madrasas, for example, there's an awful lot of chanting in these early classes, and every culture seems to see it as a way of bringing children into the circle of the elders, as it were, and making them. So primary school classrooms use joint speech for a wide variety of purposes. There's a PhD for everyone in the room here. There's the range of phenomena that are available. There's another really interesting case, for example, if you're walking down a pedestrian street and you see someone who's about to do a juggling trick or a fire-eating trick, and they've got a crowd around them, and they wait till they've got the crowd, and then they say, do you want to see a show? Do you want to see a show? And when you say yes, you're committed. Now they've got you, because now you're officially part of the spectators. You're not just a passerby anymore. It's a real clever use of technology. So human microphone is one example of this as a technology that classrooms, street performers, there's many other examples of this being a sort of a technology that we've been using all along. Yeah, it's very finely differentiated and poorly mapped.
Okay. Sorry, yes, we have a lot of questions.
I'm going to stand up for this one. So your definition, the act of uttering the same words at the same time by multiple people. I would submit, and I could argue this at length, but we don't have time to, I just want to sort of put it out there. I would submit that the very notion of word and the notion of sameness of word, or the notion of utterances of the same words by the same people, that those are conceptions that we acquire through writing.
Yes.
We acquire them through writing. And so I think the only thing in your talk that I didn't wholeheartedly want to applaud was the little opposition you set up between writing and speech. Because in fact, writing is a technology that speakers have used to amplify not only what they do, but the way they can think about what they do, and thus the way they can do more with it. And I think it's really important thing. By the way, it's also important to, in that context, to remember that only some very small fraction of writing is for the purpose of representing speech. As I think, as you yourself said to me in a conversation recently, there's calculating. And the earliest forms of writing that are extant were actually
spreadsheets.
That means of representing what we say about the world. It means of representing the world for some particularly cognitive development purposes. So they were like speech itself. They were on all fours with speech as direct ways of grappling with the cognitive domain. So at some point, somebody got the bright idea of using that for thinking about speech too.
Sure.
And then we're off to the races.
Sure.
But
We
I suspect it's more ancient than 5,000 years.
Yes, no, I'm quite sure it is. And part of my problem is I come from somewhere, I come from a highly literate culture myself. I read books, goddammit, and I use my computer and I'm on my phone all the time. And in order to make myself aware of this phenomenon, and like I say, I'm just sitting here in awe going, well, what else is there? What else is there? I have to try in my head to undo all this, while at the same time looking forward to a rapidly changing media landscape in which I'm slowly becoming sensitive to the fact that all these various forms of coordination are changing the shared world, or the way we bring a world into being together. I'm not going to dispute the fact that they're at all. I'm not trying to exclude something, I'm just using this as a means of saying, hey, look over here. Yeah.
Sorry, Anna is next.
Thank you, Fred. So this is the question is prompted by, remember this morning when Dan framed, and he was just mentioning in passing, he mentioned this when you start thinking about the things in your gut, you have fear. My instant reaction is always this fear that I get with it when I hear chanting these things, this fear. And then it takes me to...
Be careful what you say.
But you see, and what I'm getting at here is the moral dimension of language. And I'm thinking specifically of language neither as this message passing, neither as your structure, but something that humans do together, this mutual exploration. So that type of thing that you find in Austin and where the giving of uptake and so on. So it seems to me that there's a fourth aspect of joint speech, which is that of speaking together that doesn't really fit either this model, but also the standard message passing models that you mentioned.
What is the one that doesn't fit? Because I mean, like I say, joint speech is very, very many things, and the focus on speech is just a means of drawing our attention. We find everything on the edges. So Sufi chanting, for example, starts with words and ends up with coordinated breathing, and these kind of body moves.
So maybe I'm missing one. So I think there's
I'm not trying to draw lines around it.
Yeah, so you regard this as precisely a dialogue where the engagement, because I guess that's
Not a dialogue.
Well, I mean, so it seems to me that the moral dimension of speaking together in the sense of using humanity for ethical growth and all the rest of it, this mutual exploration. It seems to me that I'm just frightened. Yeah? So it seems to me that isn't really, when I hear the football fans in Manchester where I live,
Oh yeah.
that it's that element that's missing.
Well, now sometimes because I say I've studied chant, people think I am some kind of hippie, but I'm not. I don't study chant because it's all very nice and it's good for you. Chant is also the means by which children bully each other. It's a classic means by which children bully in the playground, for example. Chant was used. It's smacked at the Nuremberg rallies in North Korea. Chant is not. This is not by no means all a good thing. That's why I'm very hesitant to suggest that we absolutely have to get on the job of developing technologies for this. If I might just give one example that might allay your fears somewhat. There's an extreme example in which the words are reduced to a minimum but the participation still exists, and that's the commemorative silence that happens after tragedies. So I've given talks on joint speech in France repeatedly after dreadful tragedies, and usually I want to just play a little bit of the commemorative silence in order to illustrate my point. When you start doing that, you can't stop. It will be obscene to stop. So we have to sit there for the whole minute because it's the one kind of participatory joint speech that actually transmits over a network because all there's left is the participation, no words.
Sorry, Anna, we will
No,
have a lot of questions.
that helps. It's like actually joining, and in joining you are. Yeah. Okay. So
Yeah.
I think I have.
Is yours a follow-up, Richard? Or just a question? You're on the list, so Nick.
Thanks, Fred, for a really interesting talk. Just quickly to return to your point around the idea of chanting and the distinction of what happens to the gaze. You talked about the meter being paramount to chant, but just in relation to...
No, chant is not metered.
Sorry, not metered, but the idea of, you talked about the melody, the introduction of melody shifting, the idea of freeze, where it's not looking at, say, a figurehead, for instance.
In various forms of choral performance, everyone looks forwards.
Is
Yeah.
there anything you could say around the introduction of melody as being responsible for this kind of movement from, say, chant and this fixing of the gaze towards...
No, I think it has to do with the purpose because when we chant, we're not negotiating. That's why I said it's not dialogue. Normal conversation is more like boxing. I don't even like, the way people say we take turns in speech. Boxers don't take turns punching each other. Chess players take turns. Boxers don't take turns. Conversational partners don't take turns. They spar for it. And that sparring is absent in joint speech. But usually. There was an atheist conference in Australia where there was a bunch of Wahhabis outside saying, Richard Dawkins, burn in hell! Christopher Harris, burn in hell! And it was very, very fun. And the atheists came out and they all started a counter chant. So they're going, where are the women? Where are the women? And so you got the Islamists on one side and the atheists on the other. And they had a kind of a battle going on, but that's very rare. Football fans do it sometimes.
All right. First of all, very interesting talk. Also hearing about joint speech, which does seem under-investigated and interesting in any context. But I have a question, perhaps returning a bit to the beginning of your slide with the whole way or purpose of language research, and how do you see joint speech? What is its role in the evolution or origin of language in that sense? Because monkeys, to my knowledge,
I don't know what language is. When we look at joint speech, I said we can start with the view that language is message passing, and then we miss joint speech entirely. Or we can ask the question, what the hell happened to our species? And then I believe we have to broaden our gaze, and this seems like one of the kind of things that we need to include. That's why I suggested the term languaging. That's why I think, as ugly a word as it obviously is, I think it has its purposes to sort of knock us out of our usual way of talking about language. So I can't answer your question as to what role this played in language, because I have to drop that term in order to see this first. I suppose.
If you keep your questions short, we might get through them. So.
This should be very short because it's almost entirely addressed by that. But it's just going back to languaging, as I understand, it's a type of structural coupling. The term.
Yeah, well, that was Maturana's,
Yeah. So it's a coordinating activity. So I mean, they considered that to be antithetical to information passing idea. That basically you could look at it all as structural coupling. It was highly against the informationist or representationalist view. So I guess you see them as sort of coexisting, or the information one exists inside of a broader scheme of structural coupling, or
I'm highly ecumenical. I think we need different accounts for different, in order to make different phenomena intelligible. There are phenomena that are intelligible with even the undisciplined use of the term information. There are phenomena that are intelligible with the very disciplined use of the term information. Joint speech doesn't make sense to me in terms of information. I'm not suggesting this fits into the one true story about everything that's ever happened. All I'm saying is that if you look this way, there are stories to be told. Yeah.
Okay, last question, Richard, and then the rest of them we'll have to get to.
Richard.
Thank you very much. Great. Wow. What I want to know, though, is really why are protest chants so utterly rubbish?
Well, you know, it's really interesting.
Linguistic constructs. They are feeble and pathetic.
No.
Yes, they are.
A lot of them are, and some of them have a real staying power. Salvador Allende's campaign in Chile used a Pueblo Unido, Llamarse Vencido, which has been repeated and became the chant in the Arab Spring, Ashap, Yuskat al Nizam, and is reproduced again and again. Some countries that don't have traditions of protest are terrible at chanting. Chinese chants are absolutely awful. It's because they don't allow an awful lot of chanting. The only chanting you get in China really is in Hong Kong. In Taiwan, maybe. Some people are lousy at it, and it's a real skill to come up with a good protest chant. But, you know, rabble-rousers, political leaders, those people who move mobs, some people are more effective at moving mobs than others. If you have this skill, it's going to be a good one. And that, again, takes me back to, do we really want technology to support this? I don't know. I know it's an opening, and I know we could make millions, but I don't know if I want to walk that way.
All right, I'm the friend.
When is the next session begin? We're behind it.
10 minutes, is it?
10 minutes, cup of coffee, cigarette, back in.
10
Time for
12
coffee.
minutes coffee.
No rest for the weekend.